Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening, this is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. First, he bound and beat his girlfriend, a 43-year-old librarian. Then he went after her teenage daughter, warning her, "Scream and I will kill you both," before knocking her unconscious. When the teenager awoke, he proceeded to rape her, and in a final horrifying act of depravity, he forced the girl to watch as he slit her mother's throat. But the killing didn't stop there. Stephen Stanko was described as a perfect gentleman who seemed so pleasant and so normal. But behind Stanko's mild-mannered appearance, round spectacles, and quiet intelligence was a cold-blooded ex-convict who kept a grisly scrapbook on serial killers and convinced everyone he was a nice guy until he killed and killed again. A well-orchestrated manhunt caught up with Stanko, who tried to get away with his crimes by pleading insanity. But the jury saw through his ruse, and the ruthless killer was sentenced to death. The book this evening that we're featured is A Psycho Killer's Vicious Attack, Watch Mommy Die, by veteran journalist and best-selling author Michael Benson. Welcome back to the program, and thank you to agreeing to this interview, Michael Benson.
Thanks so much, Dan.
Thank you, Michael. Great book once again. Congratulations on doing it again, scaring the hell out of the public. So here we go. And so one of the questions I always ask, and I think it's of interest to people, how and why did you decide to write a book about Stephen Stanko and this particularly interesting murder trial and case?
Well, the first thing that I learned about Stanko after I found out about the murders on the Internet was that he had himself written a book while in prison. And it was that sort of Jack Henry Abbott angle that first attracted me to the case. I wasn't into it very long, though, before I realized that the true focal point of my story had to be the evil that's within Stephen Stanko. You know, he's one of those rare psychopaths who has the looks and charisma to start new relationships and be socially active, even as he's running for his life. And in that sense, I think he reminds a lot of people of Ted Bundy. Watch Mommy Die is not just about Stanko's most heinous act, although we certainly deal with that at length, but it is also a character analysis of a ladies' man, a con man, a sex criminal, and a murderer who could have had it all in the straight world, but who instead lives today on South Carolina's death row.
Now, yes, what you're saying, too, is very interesting, too, because for many books, we do get inside the killer to a certain degree, but in this particular case, because of the research that you've done and this particular killer's character, we really do see, incredibly, the development of a serial killer and the development of this particular serial killer and how he became who he became. Ultimately, so very, very fascinating and a little bit.
So he becomes a serial killer in increments.
Yes, it's a real development, real behind the scenes on how this could possibly happen and his motivation and his mindset. So incredible. Now you start off the book with the 911 call from Penny Ling, but let's, as we spoke beforehand, let's first describe Stephen Stanko, the main character in this book. Tell us about Stephen Stanko, what you found out about his early life, so we can draw a definite portrait of this killer.
You know, Stanko was born in 1968, and he was born on the island of Cuba. That's a little unusual. He was born in Guantanamo Bay. His dad, William Stanko, was a master chief in the Navy. And Stephen had 2 brothers, 2 sisters. And before we start blaming the household for creating a psycho killer, all of his siblings turned out okay. One died in an accident, as you'll hear about, but he's the only one who came out creepy. When he was little, his dad was transferred to the Naval Weapons Station in Goose Creek, South Carolina, which is a town, suburb really, of about 17,000, just north of Charleston, South Carolina, and that's where Stanko grew up. Now, with every book I write, the research is never 100% fulfilling, and one of my frustrations when writing Watch Mommy Die was that we still don't know much about the Stanko family chemistry, but what we do know isn't good. The Stankos didn't talk about it. The only evidence we have is from outsiders, people who, for whatever reason, found themselves inside the Stanko home watching the family interact. So it's not the best evidence, but it's what we have to go on. Right. According to one witness, no one was happy in the Stanko house. One witness said it was grim. The dad ran such a tight ship, as you might expect from a military dad, but it went beyond just militaristic. It was so regimented as to suck the joy from life. Now, one witness said that the dad seemed at times to be a cruel man, and that was the word that the witness used, cruel. One thing is for sure, the rules were stringent and enforced with punishment. Now, they can't really blame that on Stanko's problems because up until the time he was a teenager, he thrived on it. He loved the disciplined atmosphere. He entered high school, the guy who had everything going for him. He was tall and good-looking, and he was good at sports, baseball, football. Plus, he was smart. His teachers got dreamy-eyed thinking about him. And I've seen this happen. They knew the boy was going to go far, and they were going to be able to say they knew him when. And really? Stanko himself was just, he was Mr. Confidence. He just assumed that he was one of the best and the brightest. He was going to attend the Air Force Academy and become a fighter pilot. And after that, the sky was the limit. He was going to join NASA, become an astronaut. He was going to go into politics, become president of the United States. As a teenager, the moon literally seemed to be within Stanko's reach. And he had the drive to do it. His father had seen to that. Dad drove Stephen with ridicule. Stanko's father was never satisfied with anything Stephen did. He was never good enough. And pleasing his father became all important to Stanko. It was like an obsession. He was already as impeccably neat as he could get. It had been years since he'd received a demerit over his appearance. He would look kempt when he got up in the morning. He'd look kempt when he got home at night. And when it came to schoolwork and studies, he worked really, really hard, but he could never satisfy his father. Stanko believed that the only way to shut his dad up was to become rich and famous. Well, then the whole chemistry changed. Tragedy struck. Stanko's brother, Billy, who was older and had already moved out of the parents' house and into a place of his own, died in a house fire. Maybe it was arson, nothing they could prove. Anyway, Stephen's bright future instantly dimmed. Since there was a pecking order in the Stanko family, and Stanko believed that as Billy was older and now gone, Stephen, would move up one notch in his father's estimation, sort of like a battlefield promotion. And that, I think everyone will agree, is an extremely odd and selfish interpretation of events, and very revealing when it comes to how Stanko's mind worked even then. Anyway, Stanko's dad did not give him more respect after Billy died. In fact, he acted meaner towards Stephen than he ever had before. Stanko complained that it was as if his dad thought he was responsible for Billy's death. And to be fair to the dad, everyone has a right to be cranky when they lose a son in a fire or otherwise, and it's entirely possible that he was meaner to everyone in general. But Stephen didn't see it that way, couldn't see it that way. He was absolutely selfish in every possible way, and he noticed only that his father's attitude changed towards him. So Stanko lost the eye of the tiger when it came to his brilliant future. The death took the wind right out of Stephen's sails, and he began to look for easier ways to get by in life. Now, instead of schoolwork, he dedicated his intellect to working on schemes. Convoluted plots to get ahead. Convoluted plots to get rich. He took the SAT exam, didn't do that great, and was rejected by the Air Force Academy. So when high school was over, instead of becoming a fighter pilot, an astronaut, and president of the United States, Stanko took a couple of courses at the community college and began to steal cars. So it's quite a plummet.
Yeah.
Now, by the time he's in his early 20s, he's on probation for grand theft auto. This leads up to 1992. He's about 23 or 24 years old, and his life takes a turn for the better. He gets a job as a sales rep for a telecommunications company, and there in the office he meets a woman named Elizabeth McClendon, who's a single mom with a son in grade school. Liz had a quality that Stanko found most seductive. She was extremely good-looking, of course, homecoming queen, plus she was also ambitious. After her divorce, she'd returned to school, earned a degree, and was out there banging heads in a man's world, trying to make something out of herself. Liz thought at first that Stephen was shifty. Something about his eyes. She didn't quite trust him. But he wouldn't leave her alone, and he eventually wore her down and worked his way into her heart. And Stephen and Liz had a lovely romance during which he gave her a detailed autobiography that was only about 40% true. See that house? I used to own that house, he'd say. See that boat? That used to be mine, too. I had to sell them because some woman down in Georgia ripped me off. That's the sort of stuff he would say. And Liz fell into his spell. Totally unprepared for, I guess we all are. Our tendency is to trust people, especially if they're good looking.
Right.
And by the time she figured out he was a con man, emotionally speaking, she was in so deep that extracting herself was complicated.
Mm-hmm.
She later said, speaking to her today, she's filled with wisdom about him. She would say that he would boast about everything. Every nook and cranny of his psyche was exaggerated. She once told me that if an ant crawled across his foot, he would claim it was a ladybug.
Yeah.
There's nothing. He had the magnifying glass on every little thing. So Stanko had the soul of a con man. He was a smart guy. Yes, go ahead.
So how did she manage to extract herself from the relationship? What precipitated?
Well, we're going to get to that. He spends 8.5 years in prison, and that pretty much breaks up the relationship.
Sure.
So anyway,
was he convicted? Sorry for interrupting. What was he?
It's okay.
Explain what he was convicted for, or if we're
we're going to get to that. We're leading up to that.
Okay.
He was still on probation for stealing cars when he starts a relationship with Liz, and although he continued to make money through illegal means, she didn't know it. His methods became more sophisticated. He stopped just physically stealing cars, and now he got a job at a used car lot, sold cars to people, and kept the money. Now he was going around to friends and neighbors looking for investment partners, people who would go in with him on a used car business. He would tell them they could make a bundle if they invested now, but it had to be now because there was a limited window of opportunity. And he'd take on partners and make excuses as to why the investment lacked profits, ever more complicated lies, creating tangled webs. And Stanko's companies were always on the verge of making a mint right up until the instant they became valueless.
Sure.
So, he was just an incredible liar. He would tell one series of lies to one person, completely another set of lies to the next person, and he'd remember what he told to who so that he wouldn't contradict himself. There are a lot of people who can't lie for 5 minutes without betraying themselves. Stanko could go for weeks. But, and it was a big but, he didn't know when to stop. He couldn't stop. He was a very good liar, but not a perfect one. He would eventually lie himself into a corner, and sadly, violence would erupt the second the jig was up. He felt trapped, and he would lash out. When you look at the mechanics of a con, Stanko was very good at some aspects of the technique, but comically poor at others. He could convince anyone of anything, but any con artist will tell you that the most important rule is, after the con is complete and the cash is in your pocket, get the hell away from the victim. Get away from the mark. Now, Stanko repeatedly screwed up his life because once the con was done and the money was in his pocket, he was horrified to discover that he was working with or living with the people he just conned.
Right.
So, and when he did lash out violently the first time, Liz was his target. It was his own frustration over the mess he'd made of his life that led to the attack that would put him behind bars for almost a decade. Yeah, Liz and Stephen's relationship had become tumultuous by that time. He'd been caught committing fraud, and Liz paid for his lawyer. They broke up temporarily and stopped being romantic permanently when Stanko, during one fight, put his hands on her throat. And then after a period of separation, she let him come back. And for that, she would never be able to forgive herself. It was, we're up to February 96 now. And Liz is sick of the Stanko drama. You know, she's on to him. The criminal activity, the lying, she's paying bills. So he stood too close to her. She pushed him away. He lost his temper. There was a tussle that broke up, and peace appeared to have returned. She went to sleep, but in the morning, the fight resumed. Liz was in bed crying when she heard Stanko rummaging around in a closet, and she could smell chemicals. She knew how anal he was, and she thought, well, good, maybe he's going to clean something. Well, that wasn't his plan. Stanko took chemicals from various cleaning liquids, soaked a cloth with them, and came into Liz's room. He jumped on her and held the cloth over her mouth and nose. She fought as hard as she could, and there was no doubt in her mind that he was trying to kill her. No matter how hard he tried, however, he couldn't get her to pass out. She could see the wildness in his eyes. During the attack, she managed to bite him on the left hand. She heard him say, "It always works in the movies. Why isn't it working now?" And he was talking about the chemicals over the mouth trick, and that was how she knew that he'd been planning this attack. He'd been thinking about it ahead of time. So she told him that if he just let her go, she wouldn't call the police. He said he didn't believe her. Unable to kill her by asphyxiation, Stanko tied her up good and tight and made her sit on the toilet as he showered. He told her the bad guy at his back. He is in control. As he took a shower, he was humming and singing, acting as if everything was perfectly normal. And that might have been the thing that scared Liz the most. I mean, she still shivers when she talks about it. He could just flick a switch, and his old personality was back. So, yeah, apparently the bad guy left at that point because a kinder, gentler Stanko came out of the shower. He packed a bag, released Liz's bondage, and left, thinking probably that this was all going to blow over. She was going to forgive him. But she called a neighbor, and then she called the police, and Stanko was quickly apprehended, arrested, tried, and sentenced to a decade in prison for assault with intent to kill and kidnapping. The incident with Liz becomes particularly chilling when we see how similar it is to the tragic events of 2005. Clearly, Stanko saw the attack on Liz as an incomplete murder, something he was going to have to make up for when he was next a free man. So
now tell our audience about his incarceration.
Yeah, well, he's in prison from 1996 to 2004. He serves 85% of his sentence, 15% off for good behavior. He was never a discipline problem, and it's what Stanko did while in prison that made him extraordinary. And like I said, this was when I first heard about the case. This was the thing that I thought was most interesting. While in prison, he wrote part of a published book called "Living in Prison: A History of the Correctional System with an Insider's View." The book was Stanko's idea. Almost as soon as he went into prison, he began taking notes and writing a manuscript about his prison experiences, starting with how he was processed into the system and how he learned, sometimes the hard way, how to get by in different situations. And just as a professional writer might, he wrote an outline for the entire work, perfected a few sample chapters, and wrote a query letter that he sent to publishers. Right. And the query was so good that Stanko received an immediate positive response from a small New England press, and he found an editor who was interested. And she thought it might, they were doing a series of books on different social situations for high school kids. And she thought that a prisoner writing about being in prison would be perfect for that series. So she said that the manuscript would carry more weight if he teamed up with a college professor or some other kind of scholarly type And but he was on his own. She wasn't going to recommend anybody.
Right.
So he started sending query letters to college professors, and sure enough, they were interested as well. There were some bumps in the road. The first manuscript was supposed to be geared for high school students, but was written in a very adult manner. They forgot about it was part of a series, and they wrote the book they wanted to write, which never works in publishing. Rule number one for anybody who wants to be a professional writer: write what they want you to write, not what you want to write, because they're not going to change their mind.
That's right.
Just a tip. And I think that most people who have been a professional writer for any amount of time have run into that very problem.
Sure.
Know the specifications and hit them as perfectly as you possibly can. So anyway, that writer quits, and then he's brought back, and there's a shake-up in the lineup, and some people are on board for a while, and then they come back and they just write the foreword. But eventually, the book finally comes out. And by the time it does, the co-authors are Wayne Gillespie and Gordon A. Cruz. Cruz was an assistant dean at Roger Williams University when the book was written. He's now a tenured professor at Marshall University. And Gillespie was a criminal justice professor at East Tennessee State University. So they fit the bill fine. And by the time the book comes out, even though that Stanko was the driving force behind it, he's only written the last 3 chapters of the book. Comes out as a hardcover, library bound. I have a copy. I understand that when Watch Mommy Died came out, sales of Stanko's Living in Prison also went up. So I guess I earned him some royalties.
Sure.
Actually, I know and like Gordon Cruz, so if he gets the royalties, that's fine. I don't think Stanko's getting any royalties in prison.
No.
But anyway, he wrote the last 3 chapters of the book that came out. It's Prisoner's Narrative, The Prison Environment, and Surviving in Prison. Still, when he gets out of prison, after 8.5 years in, he's a published author. And he thinks that, unlike 99% of the other prisoners, he's moved up socially during his time inside. And that now the re-entry into the free world is going to be completely seamless. Well, of course, it didn't work out that way.
Now, once he gets out of prison, he's not shy about telling people that he's in prison, but there is a but to this as well. He doesn't tell them about the kidnapping charges. He tells them what? What does he tell them about his stay in prison?
Well, he says, I was just in for some white-collar stuff, some white-collar crimes, and my wife, he refers to Liz as his wife, which just irks her to no end. My wife was getting a little mouthy, and I had to I had to tie her up for a little while so that she'd or else she wasn't going to let me pack. I couldn't pack and leave because she was in my face, so I had to do something. So the horrific details of the crime he doesn't tell people, but he tells everybody he's just out of prison because he can't brag about the book without saying that he was a prisoner.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean it's funny that there are different levels of resistance when a fellow like myself goes into an area and tries to talk to people. And I was getting a very negative reaction for a while from some people every time I mentioned Stephen Stanko, and I want to write a book about Stephen Stanko. And it didn't occur to me for a long time, and things got a lot better once it did occur to me, that they thought I was writing a book with him, that this was his next book, and he was writing about the murders, and I was his co-author. And I said, no, I'm writing about him, not with him. If I'm writing with somebody, it's with the police and the victims. I'm not on his side in any way. And then they said, oh, okay, we'll talk to you.
Now, one of the people, the person that he bumps into very soon after being in prison is a woman named Laura Ling. So tell us about their meeting, where Laura Ling was working, and the ruse that Stephen Stanko employed to gain her trust.
Well, he gets out, it's July 2004 at this point, and he goes to the Myrtle Beach area of South Carolina, where, of course, it's gorgeous in the summertime. And he feels at this point, and understandably so, that his true calling is to be a writer. Sure. You know, with one book out, his best bet is to write another book as quickly as possible, All he needs is a home base.
Sure.
So he spends a few days in a rooming house with the landlady's the mother of one of his people in his cell block in prison.
Yeah.
But then he's out on his own. He's sort of homeless. So he's wandering from library to library, and he finds a library that has a pretty librarian. He says, "This is perfect." And that was how he met Laura Ling. She was the beautiful librarian, and she was a single mom living with her equally beautiful 15-year-old daughter. And mother and teen daughter lived in Murrells Inlet, South Carolina, just north of Myrtle Beach, which was the longtime home of action mystery writer Mickey Spillane. And after a few months of working with Laura on material that he's putting together for his second book, they begin a romance, and it comes to a point where she brings him home to meet the daughter to see if it's okay if he moves in with them. So and he is so pleased that her mother is happy because she's a divorced woman, she's lonely. And he's so pleased that she says, "I don't care if the guy's an ex-con. He seems like a nice guy to me. He can move in." So Stanko moves in with the two of them. And in light of what happened, we can only imagine how Stanko's mind must have been squirming during that process. He must have been like Humbert Humbert in the Nabokov novel Lolita, moving in with Lolita and her mother. I mean, it's a twofer, he's thinking.
Sure.
Now
she had also introduced him to her parents, and also told her parents that he had been out of prison. But she was very impressed that he was an author. So tell us.
Well, that's right. She's a librarian. He walks up to her and he says, "Let me introduce myself. I'm Stephen Stanko, the author." She's in a branch library in South Carolina. They don't get many authors. Sure. So she's pretty impressed right off the bat. He has some celebrity status. First thing she does is she goes on the internet and makes sure that he's telling the truth. And there it is. Amazon.com's got it for sale. Living in Prison by Stephen Stanko. So, she has there's absolutely no hesitance on her part to help him with his research, even though the nature of his research is maybe not the best thing for an ex-con. Let's put it that way. I don't want to, so while spending the days at the small branch library with Laura Ling, and she's working as his research guide, he researches a study of serial killers.
Sure.
And then this catches my attention too, because it looks like something I might write. He wants to write a book about sort of a serial killer hall of fame. And he says fame, not shame, as is true of many psychos. He doesn't distinguish between fame and notoriety.
Right.
So, and he would have categories. The deadliest killer, the Green River Killer, because he had the most kills. The most perverse, Jeffrey Dahmer. The wildest crime scene, a virtual tie between the Black Dahlia Avenger and the Gainesville Ripper. Now, in a lot of ways, Stanko's tastes were very much like those of your average true crime reader. And, Dan, I'm sure a large percentage of your listeners right now would not have found Stanko's research esoteric at all. He dug Ted Bundy and Zodiac and Son of Sam and Jack the Ripper. He researched Arthur Shaw across the Genesee River Killer and BTK, the fine torture kill guy from Wichita, Kansas. And in some cases, he wrote his theories about serial killers in a notebook, but he also made photocopies of newspaper and magazine articles on the subject, and he pasted them into a scrapbook very, very neatly, as his father would have approved of. So, later, after Stanko was captured, it was Sheriff A. Lane Cribb of Georgetown County in South Carolina who gave personal attention to Stanko's writings and clippings after his arrest. And all of the papers were confiscated, and Sheriff Lane noticed that the tone of Stanko's work changed over time. It started out being an encyclopedia of serial killers, but it turned into a guidebook for someone learning how to become a serial killer.
Wow.
Stanko had started to kill someone once, Liz McClendon, but he stopped before finishing the act. and did an 8-year stretch in prison despite letting his victim live, and that must have been a source of great frustration for him. He must have wondered how it would have felt to take a life, and how would it feel to play God in that way. And like any smart guy, he was doing his homework. He was learning how to kill, and his research assistant, the beautiful Laura Ling, was going to be his first victim. Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, the other person we got introduced, and maybe this is jumping ahead just a little bit, is that he was introduced to 74-year-old Henry Lee Turner through Ling.
Right, yeah.
They were friends.
Henry Turner becomes his friend. Henry Turner is another guy who hangs out at the library a lot. A retired man, lives in a trailer, nice little bachelor pad, and is trying to become computer literate. One of the things that Laura Ling did in her spare time was she taught elderly people how to use computers. Right. And that was the connection there. And I think one time when she went over to Henry Turner's place to help him with his computer, she brought Stanko along with her, and then Henry and Stanko hit it off, and then they ended up riding motorcycles together and then playing pool and having a good time. But yeah, he's pertinent because he becomes Stanko's other murder victim. Right. So even now, as he's... Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. What I thought was interesting, too, is that you've put in your book, just to show the psychopathology of this guy and the lack of shame, is that in September he sent a proposal for a grant, and I guess with Laura Ling's help, to work with underprivileged kids for the National Justice, sort of a scared straight type program.
Yeah. Well, and that's sort of what living in prison was as well. I mean, he could definitely reinvent himself as a boon to society at will, and that's just an example of it. You know, I mean, even when he's writing his serial killer book, or if, you know, taking his notes for it anyway. I don't think he ever got down to actually doing a manuscript, but as he was working on that, he was still pulling cons in the area. He couldn't help it. He needed to manipulate people. I've heard say that psychopaths can actually be functional better in prison because all opportunities to manipulate people have been taken away. That's why the only time Stanko isn't a con man is when he's in prison. He has to actually create a product, and that's the book. You know, outside of prison, he can just lie and say there's a product and sell that. So anyway, in December of 2004, he's been out for about 6 months, something like that. He walks into a furniture outlet store in Surfside Beach, South Carolina, and he scams the owners out of a couple $100 because he says he's working for a charity for children's cancer. And he claims his niece was sick with cancer, and that's why he'd become personally involved with the cause. And the scam was so heinous to pretend that you're gathering money for children's cancer, but to keep the money yourself. But the woman who gave him the money later testified during the penalty phase at both of Stanko's trials, giving evidence that life in prison was too good for him. So, yeah, I mean, lack of shame was his forte.
And the thing is, I found interesting, too, is that she, despite these obvious red flags like, I'd like to give you some money, even though he never asked for any money for the charity because she felt he was such a great guy, that she said, well, can I give you a check? What's the name of the charity? He said, well, why don't you just make out that check?
Yeah, just make it out to Steve Stanko. That'll be fine. Yeah.
So, yeah, she noticed the flags much too late, but luckily she was still alive to reminisce about.
You know, we're just very lucky that, you know, tall, good-looking guys are generally not psychopaths because they certainly make more functional psychopaths than their shorter and uglier counterparts.
Yeah. Now tell us.
Okay.
Now you begin the book very dramatically because you tell us about the 911 call from 15-year-old Penny Ling, and so let's go back to. I mean, what precipitates? Again, you've laid it out basically that when he gets completely frustrated and it seems like a wall in front of him, he becomes violent. So what precipitated him getting into this mindset? And then tell us about the 911 call from 15-year-old Penny Ling.
Well, yeah, it brings us up to that day, the day that his killing spree begins. And, you know, if you ask Stanko, I mean, the problem with describing the incident is that the only witness who would tell the truth is dead. You know, Penny isn't sure how things start. You know, and she's been knocked unconscious and in a groggy state for quite a bit of it. Stanko says, well, let's forget what Stanko says, because it's just horrible. But as was true, you know, when Stanko was living with Liz, his cons became increasingly complex, and an ever-growing number of people were angry with him. And it got to a point where, as Liz had done, Laura Ling is paying his bills. She's on the verge of losing her apartment because she can't afford him, and they're having a fight. You know, Stanko says it's because she caught him with the daughter, and that but that's the ladybug crawling across the foot. That's not it. Reality. It's the fact is he's found himself painted into a corner by his own lies, and he's fighting with the woman he lived with. Only this time it's Laura Ling and not Liz McClendon. And pretty Penny's down the hall, sleeping peacefully and innocently in her bedroom. And just after midnight, Stanko ties up Laura Ling and beats her. Then he goes down the hall, tells Penny that if she screams, he's going to kill them both. And she runs to see her mother and sees her mother tied up in the bedroom. And he hits her over the head. And when she wakes up, she's being raped. You know, he places her in the master bedroom so that he can watch as he savagely beats Laura Ling with his fist, beats her face in until his knuckles are bloody. And then he makes her watch as he strangles her to death. And one of the miracles, one of the miracles of the story is that Penny survived the attack at all. Because when Stanko was done, Laura Ling was already dead. And he flipped the teen daughter onto her stomach, lifted her head by the hair, and twice slit her throat, one wound above the other. And if the knife had gone into her neck a few millimeters deeper, the girl would have been dead. And looking at it from Stanko's point of view, not killing Penny was the number one flaw in the execution of his game plan that day. He thought Laura and Penny were both dead, and this was the reason why his flight lacked urgency. He thought he had left no witnesses. Instead,
why did
Penny,
he think they were dead? What made him believe?
He says that he felt for a pulse and didn't feel one in either of them.
Right.
You know, he thought he left no witnesses. And Penny, moments after he's gone, he steals Laura Ling's red car and red Mustang and takes off. She manages to dial 911. She reports the crime, and the manhunt for Stanko starts almost immediately. So Stanko's now in a red Mustang that he's stolen from his murder victim, and he drives north to Conway, South Carolina to visit his other friend, 74-year-old Henry Turner. Right. He'd been there before.
Now, what does he say to Mr. Turner? What story does he give Turner?
Well, he knocks on the door. It's very early in the morning at this point. Maybe dawn, maybe even a little before dawn. And Turner comes to the door and says, "Stephen, what are you doing here?" And Stanko says, "My dad just died." Right. And Turner says, "Oh, come right in. Come right in." And they decide to have breakfast together. And Turner says, "You can stay here for a couple of days if you want to, take as long as you want." And Stanko says, "Well, let me borrow your truck. I'll go to McDonald's and get us breakfast." Now, what Stanko doesn't know is that while he's going to get the Egg McMuffins.
Right.
Turner gets on the phone and calls his son and says, my friend Stephen Stanko's dad just died. He's going to be staying with me for a couple of days.
Right.
Turns out to be a key factor.
Sure.
So after breakfast, Stanko rummages around. Turner's like in the bathroom shaving, still getting ready in the morning. Stanko goes to where Turner keeps his gun, .357 revolver, grabs a pillow as a makeshift silencer, and shoots Turner twice. Once in the chest, once in the back. Experts disagree as to which was first.
Right.
Leaves him dead down his... Go ahead, sorry.
Well, no, go ahead, sorry.
Leaves Henry Turner dead face down in the bedroom of his house. Now, Stanko leaves the red Mustang in front of Turner's house and steals Turner's black pickup truck.
Right.
And takes off again. And so Turner's son knows that Stephen Stanko's staying with his dad, and because Penny Ling managed to call 911 very quickly, there's already a bulletin on the TV. There's a manhunt for Stanko. His face is on TV. Be on the lookout. Turner's son says this does not bode well for Dad's safety and calls the police immediately. And that's how they discover Henry Turner's body. Now,
where is Steve Stanko's headed next?
You would think that he would just be trying to get as far away from Conway, South Carolina as possible. Just driving, stealing cars every 10 miles, trying not, but not at all. He doesn't seem to be in that much of a hurry. He drives to Columbia, South Carolina, and stops at a bar. It's called the Blue Marlin.
Right.
And he is the life of the party. He buys drinks. He's talking loudly, and he's bragging, telling everybody what a great man he is. He's in real estate, he says. I'm a big-time wheeler dealer. I own 12 Hooters franchises throughout the Southeast.
Yeah.
People say, so how'd you hurt your hand, Steve?
Right.
Because he's got no skin on his knuckles. And he changes the story a couple times. One time he says, I was running a marathon and I fell. Another time he burned his hand trying to fix his car. Another time somebody said something nasty to his dad and he had to punch the guy. Anyway, he runs up a $180 tab buying beers for everybody. And he pays the bartender with 3 $100 bills and says, keep the change. Oh, one thing I didn't mention, during his flight he stops and empties out Henry Turner and Laura Ling's bank accounts. So he's loaded with cash.
Sure.
So he seems like he couldn't seem less like he's hiding or running away. He's acting in fact like he wants to be remembered.
He even meets some people and gives them his email address, this Eric Harper.
Oh yeah. He's what you call hiding out in the open. When the Blue Marlin's ready to close for the night, Stanko says it's too early for the party to end, and a group of partiers, including the bartender who's got $120 of his money in his pocket, say, okay, let's go to this place. It stays open late. And they go to a new tavern and continue drinking. And when the night finally ends, Stanko gives his actual email address to a woman he'd met. Here, drop me a line sometime, baby. And he hits the road again. And he's still in Turner's pickup truck. But he's not sure what to do. He turns on the truck radio, and the announcer's talking about Tiger Woods leading the Masters tournament in nearby Augusta, Georgia, which is
right
due west. Now, the Masters, for those of your listeners who don't know, it's a springtime golf tournament held annually in Augusta, most prestigious golf tournament there is. It's played on a kind of fairy tale type course walled off inside a not so great section of town. And TV announcers aren't allowed to call the spectators a crowd. That's too vulgar. They have to call them a gallery. So it's kind of la-di-da. And it's been raining. So everybody who went to see the golf is in a bar someplace waiting for the rain to stop. So the town is just filled with white guys in golf shirts and cargo pants, and he's absolutely going to blend.
Sure.
And it's while in Augusta that he meets Dana Putnam, who's a beautiful woman celebrating her 30th birthday. And they hit it off, and they drink and flirt, and he says he's got to leave, and she says, no, you're in no condition to drive. You got to think he's not in any condition to drive at this point. She invites him home to sleep on her couch. And that's what he did. In the morning, he picks up his vehicle and returns his pickup, but he still doesn't leave. He goes with Putnam to church. He meets her parents. He visits her on Monday and gives her a single yellow rose. Tells her he's sick of bimbos and he's looking for a woman he could stay with long term.
Sure.
But he's got everybody conned, including himself, because he really should be trying to get away. I mean, he's in Augusta having a meal in a restaurant, and he has no idea that there are 24-hour news channels that are putting his face up on the screen every 5 minutes. So it's Dana Putnam's mom who eventually sees Stanko's picture in the paper, and she calls her daughter with the bad news. She's, if he's there, get the heck away from him, and if he's not, call the police. Well, he wasn't there. He was in a restaurant having breakfast. So Putnam called the cops, and the next time Stanko called her to tell her how much he loved her, the police were listening in, and by the time he walked out of the restaurant and into the parking lot, multiple law enforcement agencies were on the scene, and he was arrested without resisting. Which brings us up to the trial.
How did police proceed with the questioning of Stephen Stanko?
I'm sorry, say that again?
How did the police proceed with the questioning of Stephen Stanko? You say he was arrested without incident, but how did they proceed? What was he? Did he lawyer up immediately? How did he react to being arrested?
Well, he seemed convinced from the start that he was going to be able to talk his way out of it.
Sure.
Pretty soon he realizes that he has left a line of breadcrumbs from the crime to himself. He even left his first stolen car at the scene of the second murder. I mean, it's just following the chain of evidence is very easy, and he's going to be convicted. He eventually realizes this. So he lawyers up with an insanity defense in mind. Something wrong with him. His brain just doesn't work right, and he's really sorry all this stuff happened, but it's not his fault, because sometimes he loses control of himself. So, the defense was an insanity claim, and the jury ended up seeing a series of doctors who showed them PET scans, PET standing for positron emission tomography, and 3D pictures that show in colorful light the parts of a person's brain, not only their structure, but how they are functioning. If a part of your brain is not functioning, it doesn't light up as brightly. And Stanko's frontal lobes, where his impulse control was supposed to live, had shriveled up and ceased to work, according to the PET scan. His frontal lobes, in terms of just size, were among the smallest 2 or 3% of the population, and those frontal lobes were, as his lawyers explained, what made him human, or what made other people human. He didn't have them. So there it was, insanity you could see. Nothing theoretical about it. There it is, insanity. The defense theory was that Stanko's frontal lobe was injured when he was in an accident as a teenager. He got hit in the forehead with a beer bottle. So it's the best they could come up with. They also threw in some testimony about a touch of jaundice he'd had as a newborn baby, hoping that might infer that was when his frontal lobes died. But they didn't seem to really have an accident that fit the PET scan. So the prosecution had a quick response. Junk science. Maybe the science was good, but the application was way out of sync with reality. Defense shrinks interviewed Stanko, but the things he said were not always helpful. That was when he said, for example, that little Penny had come on to him and they were having an affair, and that's when Penny's mom found out about it, and that's how the trouble started.
Sure. Doesn't do much
so
good.
I think the most dramatic part of the trial was when Penny testified. I mean, she
what I
talked
thought
about.
was interesting is that she brought the same teddy bear, and we glossed over a little bit, but the very caring and very diligent police officers, sergeants, and everybody involved in the investigation of this. And right away, when Penny was, obviously her mother was murdered, this police officer recognized that he just went out of his way, bought a teddy bear, and gave it to Penny. And very interesting imagery when you talk about Penny testifying at trial to help put this guy away, and she's still clutching that teddy bear.
Right. It was an EMT, but the rest of your story was absolutely correct. And they had not seen each other. The EMT and Penny had not seen each other since she was taken to the hospital, and he gave her the teddy bear the next day. And, she immediately held the teddy bear up to show him that he had it, and she clutched it while she was on the stand. And she was also wearing a scarf. And her testimony ended with, "Could you please remove your scarf?" And she does, and the jury gets to see the scars from her slit throat. Wow. And unbelievably, Penny's father, Christopher Ling, who's a big man with a large jaw, was there for the entire trial and for her testimony. And while she is testifying, his eyes are burning holes in the back of Stanko's neck. How he could listen to what he was listening to without attacking Stanko took the strength of 10 men. Penny's testimony would have been dramatic enough without her father in the room listening to it. She was very brave. And afterwards, her father couldn't stop talking about what a great daughter he had. She had 100 times the spine of the jellyfish who was on trial, and she was his hero. During the second trial, he testified on Penny's behalf so that she wouldn't have to go through the ordeal again. And the only time during the second trial that Christopher Ling left the courtroom was during the playing of his daughter's 911 call. He'd heard it quite a few times at that point and just didn't want to hear it again.
Yeah, it's very disturbing. She was yelling about her mother. It was just, you've captured that in the book, and it's incredible. Why was there a second? What necessitated a second trial? Just a hung jury? What happened?
No. The second trial is for Henry Turner's murder.
Oh, right. Sorry.
Now,
yes.
Yeah, they were tried separately because even though they were in the same district and the same principals were the prosecutors and the defense attorneys, they happened in separate counties. So they were tried separately. And there was, after he was convicted and sentenced to death in the first trial, there was a little bit of an uproar saying, do we really need the second trial? How can you can't execute him twice?
Sure. But
the argument against that was, doesn't Henry Turner's family deserve closure just as much as Laura Ling's family? Sure. And nobody had a good rebuttal to that, and it ended up costing the taxpayers $210,000, but Stanko was convicted twice and has 2 death sentences. So,
what was his?
If either of his sentences is ever lowered for whatever reason to life in prison, reduction of the other sentence would have to be considered as well. So, in an odd way, having 2 death sentences is to Stanko's advantage, but not much of an advantage. Chances are good he's going to be executed.
And the insanity, how did they I mean, I know there's not very many insanity defenses that are ever accepted at trial, but what did they say? What was the answer to his idea of insanity? Did he say he knew right from wrong? What was the final argument?
The jury believed that he understood the difference between right and wrong. He just didn't care. That his actions after the murders demonstrated that he knew he had done wrong and knew he had to get away. But he just didn't care. I mean, they basically said that being a psychopath is not being criminally insane, and that's generally how juries feel.
Sure.
Yeah.
What was his demeanor at trial? Sorry, what was his demeanor at trial? How did he act through these 2 trials?
He was very stoic. I mean, even when he was being condemned to die, he would nod. He had his head a little bit lowered. He'd nod a couple of times like, yep, that's what they said, that's what they're going to do. And then he would go back to being pretty much motionless and expressionless. Yeah, he was fairly blank. There was nothing to brag about. And, he did at one point, just before the sentencing, he spoke for the first time in the courtroom and apologized to everybody. But even then, he began to ramble and started to talk about movies he'd seen, and he got off the track and really didn't help his case at all.
Wow. Incredible.
Do you know about William Dale Hudson?
Pardon me?
Ring a bell?
Yes.
He was originally going to be writing a book about Stanko. I didn't know him, didn't know he had planned on writing a book about Stanko, but while he was working on that book, he died under mysterious circumstances. During the summer of 2009, he's a man in his 50s, as I am, and he left home on a business trip, called his wife while on the road to say he had a migraine and was pulling over, and was later found by fishermen floating face down in the PD River. So I guess it was my good fortune. His misfortune was my good fortune, because by the time I submitted my proposal for this book, they no longer had an author to do it.
Was he also a Pinnacle author?
Had been.
Impressed?
I don't think it was exclusively Pinnacle, but he had been.
Yeah, because I recognize that name from a few years ago.
Well, the interesting thing about Watch Mommy Die is that it is the first of my books to be released simultaneously in electronic form and book form. And it has gone to #1 true crime on Kindle.
Right on. Congratulations.
Yeah, it's even selling better than the Casey Anthony book, and her trial is going on right now. So that's good news.
Very good. It's interesting too, because it does indicate a little bit younger audience, and I know just from the true crime audience, it's not generally so young.
Right. Well, I also think that you'd obviously seen the book. It has a scary cover and a evocative title. And here in New York, many people read on the subway. It's sort of reading in public. Everybody looks around to see what everybody else is reading. I'm not sure that anybody's eager to be sitting there being the one who's reading Watch Mommy Die, but if they have a Kindle, you can read it on the subway without anybody knowing. A little bit of a guilty pleasure, I think, true crime is in a lot of cases.
Maybe so. You could be right about that, because if you do see the cover, you might wonder what the person's mindset is as well. So, yeah, it's very an e-book.
Yeah, you started by asking me about how I came across this subject. I tell you, my next book I came across because I was researching Stanko. One of the doctors who testified in his defense, one of the PET scan doctors, Dr. Wu, also, when I was researching him, also testified at the trial of Michael King in Florida, who is the subject of my next book to be released in the fall, called A Killer's Touch. So I followed the defense witness and then came across my next book.
What is the claim to fame for Michael King? Michael
King. It's a story about a young mother of two in Northport, Florida, and Michael King is just driving around, sees her in the backyard or whatever, kidnaps her, repeatedly takes her home into his self-made dungeon, where he repeatedly rapes her, and then takes her into a wooded area naked and shoots her once through the head and buries her in a shallow grave. Now, that would be sad enough, but much of the story concerns the area's 911 system. The poor victim was spotted while thrashing in the back seat of the killer's car, and multiple calls came into 911 reporting a possible abduction, yet the calls were not processed efficiently. The relationship between the calls was temporarily lost, and the police lost an opportunity to catch the guy before he killed his victim. So that's she was also a policeman's daughter.
Oh, wow.
So one of the most amazing things is that he was captured alive.
Yeah, I was going to say. Yeah.
They brought him in cuffs, not in a bag, and that's to their credit.
Yeah, absolutely. How many books have you written in the nonfiction genre, and how many specifically true crime, Michael?
Oh, boy. I think if you count the slender volumes, I went through a few years where I was writing books for children. So they each count the same. About 60 books altogether.
Wow.
The last 8 or 9 have been true crime. I began my true crime career by ghostwriting a book about a serial killer. And since then, I've done most of them for Kensington and one for Globe Pequot up in Connecticut.
Who was the first serial killer that the ghostwriting book? What was it? Who was the serial killer? Anybody know?
Well, that would be like kissing and telling. Yeah, I don't think I'm supposed to say because they might.
Okay.
The credited author may object to that.
Yeah, I understand.
He's busy taking credit.
Do you have a website, Michael?
Well, no, but you can, if anybody wants to be my friend on Facebook, just look for the Michael Benson with the white beard. I'm that guy, and I'll be glad to converse with you about whatever you want.
Right on. Now, what is the tentative title that you have for? You said I've forgotten what you said about the Michael King book that's out next.
Oh, it's A Killer's Touch.
A Killer's Touch. Great.
I think that's out in October.
October, so we'll have to have you on in October if you.
That would be great.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. Well, I want to tell people that they've been listening to Michael Benson and talking about his latest true crime, soon-to-be bestseller, no doubt, and it is already as an ebook on Kindle, Psycho Killer's Vicious Attack, Watch Mummy Die, available everywhere where books are sold and on Kindle now, so it's #1. So thank you very much, Michael, for coming on again. You're a natural-born storyteller with a fantastic book once again, and thank you very much.
Hey, thanks, Dan. I appreciate it.
Well, you have a good night, Michael. Thank you very much.
You too. And I love your show. Take care.
Well, thank you. Thank you much,
Bye-bye.
Mike. Thank you. You've been listening to the program, True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them, speaking about Watch Mummy Die from Michael Benson. Have a good evening. Good night.